is with the greatest pleasure that we're welcoming our speaker today, Jill Samuel. I have a lovely connection with Jill in that our grandchildren, my two and two of her 12, are very, very good friends. And so we've known Jill and Andy and the whole family for a long time. I've really, really been looking forward to getting to know more about Jill. When we were chatting, Jill and I, preparing for this, she said that there's a reason that she felt that she needs to tell her life story, and that as women we need to tell our life stories. So from now, I'm going to hand over to Jill, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
Okay, so here goes. I had a phone call this morning from our son Jeremy. I don't know whether Jeremy's watching, to wish me good luck. And Anthea, who's his daughter, came to the phone and said, "Don't be worried, Granny. Just tell them you're amazing and tell them lots of funny, bad jokes." So I'm not sure I can do that, but that was her advice. I've been out of the paid workforce for about 15 years. And I guess had I been working, working for money, as I always say, I'd have given a very different sort of talk. There've been a lot of men in my family who've written their life stories, and they all seemed to stop when they got married. And that included my dad, Andy, Roy Goulston, and probably masses of others. And it always makes me very cross. I had a lucky and privileged childhood, having been born far from Europe in the horrors of the last war, which is relatively unusual, I think, amongst a lot of my Jewish friends in Australia and all around the world. I was born in New Zealand, my mum from Melbourne and my dad from England. They settled in Auckland. My father, they were from very different backgrounds, I think. They were both Jewish, both from pretty orthodox Jewish families. My father's father died when he was a baby. He was 3 months old and he was the youngest of 4 boys, and my grandmother had to bring these 4 boys up. In fact, 2 of them went into an orphanage, I gather. They all ended up in New Zealand, so I knew them all quite well. Dad used to tell a lovely story of one, he got chosen to play cricket for the local, I think it was for quite a sort of impressive team. I think it was for the state or whatever you play for in England. The county. He got chosen to play for the county. The match was on a Saturday. So he put on his clothes and put on his cricket clothes, came downstairs. He hadn't had the courage to tell his mother that he was going to play cricket. She looked at him and asked what he was doing. He said, "I'm off to play cricket for the county." She put up her finger and said, "God will punish you." And off he went to play cricket. And the first ball knocked out his 2 front teeth. And he really thought God had punished him. Anyway, Mum, of course, came from a very different sort of family. Her father was an Orthodox rabbi who arrived from England. He used to drive a bike when he first arrived. Her mother was from a wealthy Jewish family. I gather that my grandmother, my mother's mother, fainted when she knew that my mother was going to marry an Orthodox rabbi. Anyway, one of the things, I've just lost all the information, so one of the family can probably tell me. I should have had all my notes in order, but I didn't. My mum's parents arrived out in Melbourne in the 1930s, and they brought with them all their possessions, including something like 150 bottles of port and wine and whiskey or something else. Anyway, it was very interesting growing up in our family, because Mum had come from a background where people were very wealthy, and my father had grown up in poverty, really. So although my father, of course, had done very well in business in New Zealand, I went to the local school. Well, I went to a Presbyterian school, the equivalent of PLC, wore black watch tartan shoes, stockings, gloves, got into trouble if you didn't do any of those sort of things. My brother, on the other hand, went to the local state school, where he my mother sent him off to school with lace-up shoes on, and he used to walk down. We had a long drive. He walked down the drive, left his shoes under the milk box, and went to school in bare feet, as people tended to do in Auckland in those days. I had a very happy childhood, really, although I guess no children ever have. There were lots of worries about things that I realise now weren't that important. And there was a lot of emphasis on our family, particularly from my mother, on being happy. We played lots of different sports. Mum had wanted to get a job when she married my dad. In fact, they met in Auckland. Mum had come over on a holiday with Edna Goulston and met my father, and they only knew each other for 10 days, and they got engaged. Dad went back to Melbourne, and Mum went back to Melbourne, I should say. Dad stayed in Auckland, suddenly realised he wanted to marry my mother, so sent her a telegram, "Will you marry me?" And Mum sent back a telegram. And for those of you who know her would know that she'd do this sort of thing. She said, "Come and get me." And my father had just got back from a trip overseas. He said he had absolutely no money, and it took him a year to save up enough money to go over, and they did get married. And it was a very happy marriage. There were lots of interesting intellectual conversations that went on in our household. There were lots of parties. I grew up in Auckland, New Zealand, and there were lots of parties held in the holidays in Auckland. There would be something like 3 or 4 guys would get together and hire a church hall or a sailing club or something. They'd put on a band, and we'd all spend the evening dancing. My mother, bless her, always insisted that I wrote thank you letters. And I would go to something like 10, 12, anything, 15 parties every holidays. They were on every night. It was all part of the culture in Auckland, I guess. And one year I got so fed up, I wrote all my thank you letters well in advance before the holidays, put them all in a little pile. My father, bless him, put them in the post and posted them. So that was very embarrassing. I wanted to do physio when I left school. And if in New Zealand, the universities at nights, when I left school, were really glorified night schools, although you could do law and a few things in Auckland. I'd got my HSC, and I wanted to do physio. You had to do physio in Dunedin. And my dad said, "No daughter of mine's going to Dunedin he'd come out from England to Dunedin, so I'm not too sure quite what he got up to there. I wasn't allowed to do it. Anyway, I did a business course and quite enjoyed that, was quite good at it. Stan Goulston, my uncle, whose daughters I think are watching at the moment, went off on some scholarship to America. And my mother was very annoyed that her sister was being left on her own with 4 young girls. So I said, "That's good, I'll go over and spend time with her." And that's exactly what I did. I had a lovely time. I worked a bit over there. I did a lot of, I worked quite a lot. I had a lovely time in Melbourne. In Sydney, I then went to Melbourne and had a lovely time with my uncle and aunt and cousins there, including Bar, who I think might be watching at the moment. And it was really nice to get to know everybody. I came back and I got a job with Hardy Trading Company. I think it was an amalgamation of Hardy Trading Company and James Hardy. They worked together. And I worked with the managing director. And one day the accountant came into the office. He was a man of 50 or 60 or something. He was pretty drunk. He'd been drinking. It actually turned out that he was an alcoholic. He was sort of rolling around the place a bit. Anyway, he went into the managing director's office, who then asked me if I'd make them a cup of tea, which I did. I made them a cup of tea, and I looked at the sugar and it looked a bit odd. It looked a bit sort of damp. So I tasted it and it tasted funny. So I said to Mr. Wheeler, look, the sugar tastes a bit odd. He said, leave it alone. Being a chemical company, they sent it off to be diagnosed. And it came back, the result came back that there was enough sodium cyanide in that sugar to kill half of Auckland. So nobody knows or knew how I'd survived. And I came home and I told my mother, who was of course horrified, rang our local doctor, whose comment was, is she alive? And Mum said, yes. He said, well, then she's going to be okay. So that was one of my funny experiences. There weren't that many Jewish people in Auckland. I think there were about 10 Jewish girls that went to the same school as I did, and probably 2 or 3 about my age, and a few guys. And my father was extremely rude every time I went out with non-Jewish guys. So people didn't go and live away from home in Auckland. So I decided that I was going to go to Australia, which apparently was acceptable to my parents. So off I went. And of course I had flattered with some New Zealanders, including Francine Kammerman. Francine, I've forgotten what her married name is, who often is a member of the Great Synagogue. Judy, fatted with Judy Green. She met Michael when she was there. Judy Marks, who met Peter. I think she's Francine Lazarus, isn't she? Yes. So she and I shared a bedroom. You know, people shared bedrooms in those days. The young Jewish crowd used to all go to Camp Cove and decide where the parties were. I was the new girl on the block, so I had a lovely time. I found Australia in those days very money conscious. People wore a lot of, not my family of course, but everybody else wore lots of jewelry and were very flamboyant and in your face, and that was very strange for a girl from New Zealand. So anyway, I had a lovely time. There were a lot of people didn't live together so much in those days, so there were a lot of single guys around. I went out with them. Of course, it was very important for me to be accepted for who I was, not who my mother was or my father was or anybody else. So I told all the guys I went out with, because somehow often they asked what my father did for a living, which I objected to very strongly. It could put me in a pigeonhole. So I said, my father worked for the city council. And one guy said to me, oh, well, if he does what I think he does, he probably earns quite well. And I said, yes, actually, we've lived very well. Well, I was silly enough to tell my father that I'd told people that, and he was not amused. Anyway, I had a lovely time. And one day we were invited to the Rosenbergs, Bruce and Alison, and the other guest there was Andy, who was over here for a law convention. There was some big law convention in Australia, in Sydney. And I remember saying to Jean, my aunt, I don't know what to do, because I've been brought up very strongly that if people come from overseas, you always entertain them and show them around. But in my day, girls didn't ask guys out. And I thought, So I don't know quite what to do about this guy I've met. Anyway, Jean said, look, if he's got any manners at all, he'll invite you out. And he obviously had a few manners, so he did invite me out. And 10 days later, we decided to get married. And I went back to New Zealand. We had a very nice wedding. I remember my parents asking me what sort of wedding I wanted. My father was a businessman. He owned, amongst other things, he was in business with his brothers. He owned, amongst other things, a clothing factory, sold the sort of things, a bit like Sportscraft here. And anyway, he had, I'll just tell you a story about Dad. He had a lovely sense of the ridiculous, Dad. And often you'd be walking along the street and he'd see a woman walking along with one of his coats, and he'd walk up to them and say, excuse me, madam, I just think your coat is so smart. Did you buy it in Paris? And the person would say, no, actually it comes from New Zealand. New Zealand, he'd say. I didn't know New Zealand made such smart clothes. And of course the woman would walk off looking. And he always was doing silly, very funny things like that. He kept us most amused. And my parents were both highly intelligent. There were lots of very interesting conversations, as you can imagine, around the dinner table. Anyway, I told my parents I wanted every single one of my friends invited to my wedding. And as far as I was concerned, they'd all be happy with a cheese sandwich and a glass of beer. Of course, the wedding was much nicer than that. And some of my cousins who were here were bridesmaids for me. I think it was a very happy occasion. Anyway, Andy and I went to England. Could tell you lots of funny stories that happened to me there, but I had the time of my life. I'd never been out of Australia or England or New Zealand. I used to leave home with Andy in the mornings and go home with him at night. I think I explored every art gallery, every museum, grand houses, everything. I just had the time of my life. And I had some very funny experiences. One day, we'd gone off to synagogue. That was an unpleasant experience for me too. Andy always, those of you who know him know he opens up. If he goes, he opens up. He likes to arrive early. We arrived at the synagogue, which was the local Sephardi synagogue. We were the only two people in there, and a whole lot of men arrived. And then this woman, I sat in the back, although Andy had told me to go and sit in his mother's seat, which was down the front. And the whole synagogue was empty. Some woman walked in and said, you're sitting in my seat. Move me along, shoved the prayer book in front of me. That was my introduction to the Sephardi synagogue. In fact, I got to know a lot of the people there, and of course they were very nice and a bit different. But I had some interesting experiences. I was introduced one day to somebody as my mother-in-law's closest friend. My mother-in-law, who was a lovely person, had stayed in Australia after our wedding. So we were invited to a party 3 months in advance. In Auckland or Australia, most people entertained about a week in advance. So I was invited to, sorry, my English is a bit bad. I think I'm a bit nervous, so I apologize for that. Anyway, we were invited I met her. She seemed very nice. She invited us to her place for dinner. Andy said Andy had time to tell me that he didn't like her son, and he knew quite a lot about her nephew, and he didn't like him. Anyway, the great day arrives. We go to her apartment, and I knock on the door. We knock on the door. The door opens. I greet what I think is our hostess very warmly. I hadn't seen her for 3 months. That was my first mistake. It turned out to be the maid who was. So we walked up the stairs. We had a lovely meal. I remember thinking, as I am now, that I seemed to be doing most of the talking. Nobody else was doing much. We had coffee. After coffee, I said, okay, thank you very much. We've had a lovely evening. I think it's time for us to go. Well, we got hassled out of the room fairly quickly with our hostess saying to me, are you not well? And I said, yes, I am well. Got hassled into the lift, got into the lift and said to Andy, okay, what did I do wrong? He said, don't you know that the eldest married couple goes home first and you were the youngest person in the room? Anyway, when I told my mother, she giggled and said, I've never had a boring night in my life. As soon as your father gets bored, he says, time to go home, and we leave. I did tell my mother-in-law. She wasn't all that excited that I'd done the wrong thing, I have to say. Anyway, not too many people seem to know that rule, and I certainly never had. Anyway, we had a lovely time in England, as you can imagine. In some ways, I feel a bit sorry that I didn't get a job and work for money, but I had the time of my life. London is such a fabulous city. I explored it all day, every day. I loved most of the English people that I met. I made a few faux pas, but too bad. We then, Andy had agreed that we would live in Sydney, and his law firm, he was a partner in a City of London law firm, and they insisted that he give a year's notice. So that's why we spent a year in London. Then we took off for Europe. We spent 3 months in Europe. I don't know anybody who's listening who's my age. We used to do it on $5 a day or something. We stayed in the scungiest of places, I can't tell you. Sometimes we get up in the morning, because there was no accommodation for married couples. So if you wanted, all the youth hostels were only for single people in those days. So what happened, we used to get up early in the morning often and go to the local glamorous hotel into the loos and give ourselves a decent wash. We came back to London, and Andy had lived in an apartment that was on a 90-year lease. And you were allowed to break the lease, but only on condition that you introduced somebody else. So the person that was going to take over our apartment didn't. And so we advertised in every single paper. All sorts of people turned up to have a look at this jolly apartment, which was fairly tiny. They jumped up and down and they felt the roof and felt the walls, did all sorts of funny things. And eventually a guy came in and said, this is fabulous. This is exactly what I want. My name's Joe Blow. I own a shoe factory in Liverpool. I want it for my manager who's coming down to work in our London firm. So I said to him, okay, well, I need you to sign this bit of paper. And I took, the desk wasn't very far away because the apartment was pretty small. And I can still picture this guy. He looked at the desk and he said, pointed and said, what is that? I said, what do you mean, what is that? I said, that's a Harrods credit card. He said, it's got Andrew Samuel written on it. And I said, yes. He said, my God. He said, I've been lying to you. My name is not Joe Blow, it's Jack Spratt. And he said, I went to school with Andy. He'll know exactly who I am when I walk in this door. I want it. I don't own a shoe factory. I want this apartment for my girlfriend. So Andy, when I told Andy, he said, oh yes, fairly typical. He was a pretty horrid guy at school. And in fact, of course, every time Andy and I go back to London, we're dying to knock on the door and see if it's the same girlfriend living there. But she was pretty awful. He brought her along. His wife and children lived further up the train line. We couldn't, Andy's family kept saying, who did you rent it to? And we, of course, never told him. We just had a lovely time. We then travelled all around all around America. We bought a good car because in those days it was one of the things a lot of people did was buy a car in England and bring it back to Australia, and something to do with the duty you made. You didn't make any money on it, but it didn't cost you a lot of money. We travelled all around America, had the time of our lives. We then went to New Zealand. Andy loved New Zealand and would like to have lived there, but I guess fortunately, because we love living in Australia, things were tough for lawyers, so he didn't get a job there. And we came to live in Australia. We built our house in Roseville, and the house that we're still living in. Rob, our first eldest son, was born. What have I done? I've written all sorts of funny things here. Oh, yes, what I was going to say is we used to buy meat at the local kosher butcher. I don't know if any of you remember Mr. Kaplan. Anyway, the first order that I gave, the meat arrived. There was a chicken that had its feathers on, its head on, and its feet on. And I was heavily pregnant with Rob. I picked up this chicken and I went to the butcher shop and I said, "What is this?" And Mr. Kaplan said, "It's a chicken." I said, "Excuse me, I have never seen a chicken looking like that before." He said, "Your husband's very observant. This is the way we sell chickens to observant people." So I said, "Well, I'm not so observant, and if you ever do that to me again, I will not buy kosher meat, and I will never tell Andy, and you will never get an order from me again." Well, everybody in the shop was listening to this mad conversation as I burst into tears. Anyway, boy, did I get good meat from then. I'm sure he was absolutely terrified that this mad woman would do exactly what I said. Anyway, we lived in this house. Most of you have been here, and Rob was born. He came out of hospital and came home here. And one day I was feeding Rob in the kitchen and the doorbell rang. And it was a guy with a dog collar. And he introduced himself to me as the local Anglican minister. So we chatted for a bit and I said, he said, "Are you a member of our church?" And I said, "No." And I said, I invited him in for tea anyway. So he sat down at the table and we're having tea. And he asked me what synagogues I belonged to. Did I belong to any synagogues? And I said, yes, we belong to North Shore and we belong to the Great. And I had a man hanging the curtains in the family room. He was up a ladder hanging the curtains. And he said, "Oh, you belong to the Great." He said, "That's very interesting." He said, "The Great has the same problem as we do in our church in Roseville." And my mind's going at 100 miles an hour. I'm trying to think what could be the same problem. Maybe it was that not too many people appeared on a Saturday or Sunday. I said, "What was the problem?" He said, "Pigeons." He said, at which stage the guy hanging the curtains actually fell off the ladder. He was laughing so much. And he said, "Do you know we removed so many tons of pigeon dung from our roof, and the Great Synagogue did the same." So that was, I don't think I ever saw him again. The boys, we sent our boys to Roseville School. There were quite a lot of interesting things that happened there when the kids, I don't know which one was in second class, the teacher there, who was a fabulous teacher and quite eccentric, gave me a ring and said, can't remember whether she called me Mrs. Samuel or Jill, "We've got the doctor coming to school tomorrow and to examine the kids. Is there anything anything wrong with your children that you'd like the doctors to look at?" And I said, "No, Mrs. Bate, it's very nice of you to call, but I don't think so." And she said, "Well, you people are always very fussy about your children's health." And I said to her, "You people?" She said, "Yes, you Jews." So I got quite a shock about that. The other thing that happened, I was president of the Mothers Club, and suddenly somebody stood up, and there must have been about 40, 50 people in the room. Somebody stood up and said, "I'm absolutely appalled at the amount of religion that's taught in this school." Religion taught in this school? I didn't know anything about religion. I'm the only Jew. There were two Jewish families there, the Samuels and the Burstons. Everybody else was various other things. Anyway, the meeting got quite heated and people got very upset. And I came home and I said to the kids, "Any religion taught in the school?" They all said, "No, no, no." I said, "Any mention of Jesus Christ?" And Doug said, "Yes, Mum, but don't worry." He said, when they say Jesus, I close my eyes and say Moses." So the things you hear from your kids. One of the other things that cropped up, there were a lot of Lebanese children at Roseville Public School, and there was a problem apparently. They were never allowed to go to parties, and the mothers never came to meetings, and nobody quite knew why or why this was happening. So I had a brainwave. Nick Shahadi was Lebanese, I don't know, and I think if he wasn't mayor, those of you who don't know him, he was a well-known footballer here. He was mayor for a long time, and he was Lebanese. So we invited him to come to the school, and it turned out that in those days anyway, the Lebanese children had no idea of when their birthdays were. It was not something that was celebrated by them at all. And most of them, their mothers didn't speak English. So he was able to explain everything to them. We then started English classes for the Lebanese mothers at the school. They learnt English, which was good, and the children were allowed to go to parties. Next stage of our lives, I guess, we sent our sons to Knox. Andy and I, not having grown up here, had no idea where we wanted to send our children to school. And we sent them to Knox, which I think was an excellent school for all our kids. We had some funny experiences that happened there. I remember, they started in 4th class. I'm trying to think how old they would be in 4th class, 8th or 9th. And the following thing happened, told to us by Dr. Patterson, who was the headmaster. Apparently, one day after chapel or after prayers, he heard footsteps on the door, footsteps on the corridor. Knock on the door. He opens the door. It's Robert Samuel. "Yes, Robert, what can I do for you?" "Dr. Patterson, you said that Christianity is the only religion that teaches," whatever it was. Dr. Patterson said, "I'm sorry, Rob, what I meant was Judeo-Christian religions." And Rob said, "But you didn't say that, Dr. Patterson. This is this little boy. But you didn't say that, Dr. Patterson." "I'm sorry, Rob, I will apologize." The next day, do him credit, in prayers, Dr. Patterson stood up and apologized. There were various interesting things that happened at that school. I remember one day, Dr. Patterson, we're mothers meeting, about 500 mothers all in the hall, and he was talking about having trouble with a particular class, and he apparently had asked the boys in the class to write a letter on what they could do for the school. And he said, and this is one of the letters that I got, or "What the school can do for you" was the title. So he said, he then read out a letter, and the letter ended with, it had a whole lot of lists of things that the school offered him and a whole lot of things that he offered the school. which was not what they were asked to do, of course. They were asked to write a letter on what the school did for them. He didn't say that it was written by Douglas, but of course, you know, Douglas had written this letter and ended up by saying, by and large, I've got a lot to offer the school, they've got a lot to offer me, and it works. But he didn't, of course, Dr. Patterson, fortunately, didn't tell us who'd written the letter. Jeremy was in the, I seem to remember, was in the top, he was in his top cricket team. He was in the A cricket team when he had his bar mitzvah. He asked most of his team to his bar mitzvah. Of course, kids were meant to be available to play cricket. And they had to write a letter to the headmaster to say why they weren't going to appear that Saturday. And I remember that the reply they got was, "You're very privileged to be invited to a Jewish bar mitzvah. Of course you can go." And they actually cancelled the cricket match for that particular year, which was very nice. Who have I talked about? Jeremy, Colin. I remember Colin was in the top rugby teams, and one day we went to, as parents, we were invited to go to a rugby dinner. There was the rugby team, the A and the B team of the school, and the parents. And we're sitting down having a very nice evening, and the headmaster is waffling on about the football teams and the fact that they'd done their best, and apparently they hadn't done very well that day, and some guy stands up and says, "What a lot of rubbish. You know, the kids weren't well trained, they didn't play good rugby." And his wife's busy trying to calm him down and keep him quiet, and he just went whacked her across the face. There was absolute silence in the room. I'd never seen anything like that before. So our kids were all very happy there. I suppose the next thing I should talk a little bit about is me. When I worked for money, I worked for the health department. I ended up there in Northern Area Health Service, being in charge of a lot of their courses, communication courses, self-esteem courses, parents for teenagers. Most of the courses were about 20 hours. They were quite long. We charged for them. Peanuts, of course, but we were one of the first part of the health department to charge for our courses. And it was very rewarding for me. I learned heaps. I think I was good at it, and we had lots of interesting people. Must have been hundreds of people passed through our courses, most of which were about 8 weeks. We also ran, I myself was invited often to run courses with, I ran courses in business, I ran courses in hospitals, lots and lots of schools, lots of different places. And all through my life, people have come up to me and said, "I remember when you said," which is very nice. I always used to start off by saying, I don't believe there's a right or wrong way to communicate. If what you're doing works, continue doing it. If it doesn't work, we've got lots of ideas on how you can do it differently. What else do I want to say? Anyway, I don't think I'll tell you any of those sort of stories. Two quick stories at the Great. I remember Andy always wanted me to go to lunches at the Great, and I never wanted to go because I'm not into lunches. Anyway, one day I agreed to go and sat down, and I think it was Cardinal Pell who was speaking, and he actually was very boring. I'd actually heard him speak when he spoke quite well. Anyway, I'm sitting down at this table, Andy's sitting on one side of me, and there's another woman who was probably my age now, who seemed quite elderly on the other side of me. She was covered in jewelry from head to toe, all over her she had jewelry. So I sat there for quite a while feeling sorry for myself and thinking, you know I never like to come to lunches and I can talk to Andy anyway, and what on earth, and I've got nothing in common with this woman. Anyway, I sat there for a while and then I thought I would never, ever let anybody in my groups get away with saying that. So I turned to her and said, you must love beautiful jewelry. And she said, yes. I grew up in poverty in Sydney, and I've now married a man who gives me all this beautiful jewelry. And she told me about her life in Sydney with no money at all. And I can tell you that I had one of the most interesting lunches I have ever spent in my life. It was a real lesson to me. Anyway, I think, what else was I getting? Well, bat mitzvah, that was what I was going to talk about. Bat mitzvah, just briefly, bat mitzvah. I happened to be at the Great Synagogue the day the first girl did her bat mitzvah. She did very well. And I went up to her mother and congratulated her. And she said, Jill, you know, this all happened because of you. I said, oh, what do you mean because of you? Me. She said, well, I was in one of your classes. And she said, I complained about the fact that boys had these wonderful bar mitzvahs and girls all got together and chanted various things. And it was all very boring. And I apparently had said to her, don't complain, do something. And she said, I did something, and this is the first bat mitzvah at the Great Synagogue. And I remember my bat mitzvah very well, where there were a whole lot of us sitting in the front row of the synagogue and spouting forth various things. And we got given a prayer book, and I've still got the prayer book at home because one of my friends didn't believe me. And it says, given to Gillian Samuel on her consecration. So that was what they called it in New Zealand. Anyway, the next part of my life I'm enjoying. I have 4 wonderful sons, 4 wonderful daughters-in-law, all different. The guys are all different. The girls are all different. I adore them all. The adults all belong to the Great Synagogue. My brother belongs. I've got a wonderful sister-in-law who puts up with my awful bridge, a sister who's come here to live from Paris, who we get enormous pleasure from being together, and lots of cousins, and life's good at the moment. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Jill, do you want Lauren to show the photograph?
Oh, yes, good. So I just wanted to show you, for those of you who aren't familiar, this is the photograph of our family. Probably all of you that go to the Great would have from time to time had to put up with the kids crawling all over the seats, because they're so pleased to see each other. They're not usually the best behaved children in the synagogue, but many years ago we talked to one of the rabbis about the children our boys making a noise in synagogue, and his reply was, I like to see them in synagogue. And Michelle, one of my gorgeous daughters-in-law, talked us into having a commercial photographer, which we had, to take photographs of the family, which was so this sort of photograph isn't all my style, but I insisted then that one was taken that I enjoyed. And if we can see the next one, which is what tends to happen when our kids come to our place. So they're all good friends and they're all enjoying their ice creams. They're 12 fabulous, fabulous kids who give Andy and me endless pleasure, as do our sons and daughters-in-law, especially, of course, in this pandemic. So thank you very much.
Your paid work.
Pardon?
Okay, Lauren, if you could close that, and we'll go back to Jill. That was mesmerizing. you had us all spellbound, and I'm sure for those of your family members who are there, it must have been such a wonderful trip down memory lane for them. And so I would like to invite anybody in the family, if you want to say something to Jill or share, just put up your hand and we'll unmute you.
It's so lovely to see you all. I'm watching from New York, and Jill, I really loved hearing your stories and hearing you give dignity and shiny aliveness to a whole lifetime unfolding of a Jewish woman. So it was really delightful. Thank you for daring to do that.
Yeah, I did dare too.
I know you did.
That's lovely. I'm just wondering if any of Jill's sons want to say something. Rob, I see you there. Would you like to unmute? Hi, Rob.
Hi. I wasn't going to contribute, but as a son, I thought I might correct the record slightly. Mum, you were talking about your family originally coming to Australia. They came in the early 1850s on a fast steamer to Melbourne, and indeed came with his complete cellar. They were successful merchants in Germany and came out to Australia. And you know, it's in the context of modern history, it's quite interesting. In the late 1800s, they were the German consuls in Melbourne representing the German government. So things change.
The other story I loved was your chicken story, Jill. I'd never heard that, because the chicken is kosher. It has to be sent with the head and the feet and the feathers and everything else.
I don't think too many other people have heard of that.
Right. And one of the things that really touched me also when you said that, and you said this to me the other day as well, that compared to so many Jewish families, you were lucky in that your family did not have any losses in the Holocaust.
Yes, well, I'm sure there were, but our immediate family, we were extremely lucky. I mean, my grandfather, who was an Orthodox rabbi in Melbourne, I was going to tell a nice, have we got time?
Yes, you've got 5 more minutes, go ahead.
Nobody else wants to talk. A nice story about my grandfather. He was an Orthodox rabbi in Melbourne. He was actually, I think, involved in both wars, but came back alive, of course. But he used to play golf every Wednesday with an Anglican minister and a Presbyterian minister. And my father was a keen golfer, and he was 1 year in Melbourne and played with them. And he said every time they missed a shot, they would quote something from the Bible, and each one would try to one-up each other. So, that was interesting. And Andy's just reminded me, because one of the things that pushes my button, and maybe I didn't say, is I keep pulling people when I always talk about when I worked for money, because you know, we all work all the time. Sometimes we're paid for it, and sometimes we're not. I'm
sure that raising 4 sons was a lot of work.
Well, it was in those days, yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm thrilled with the way they've all turned out. And I think I didn't mention my sister-in-law too, who puts up with me at bridge every week. Not at the moment, but she was a teacher at Masada, and so often people come up and when I've been with her and talk about what a wonderful teacher she is.
Jill, we've had some lovely messages for you in our chat. Jeremy says, awesome presentation, well done, thanks. Sue Hallenstein says, loved listening to you, Jill. David and Anna, thank you for the talk. From Alex G, well done, Jill. And from Mill to everyone. So lovely, Jill. Love from Ben and Mill. From Diana and Joel Robinson. Thank you, Jill. Super presentation. And from Joe and Luke to everyone. Thanks, Jill. So great to hear your stories. They all have expressed what all of us feel. And you know, the aim of these presentations, right, when we started doing them, was to get to know each other a little better. You can see someone in shul week after week after week, and there's so much that you don't know about them, and you have most certainly fulfilled the brief and entertained us all and let us get to know you better, and we're just so grateful. I want to wish you all Shabbat Shalom. Have a wonderful Shabbat. Stay healthy, and we will look forward to seeing you on another one of our presentations. Thank you, Jill, and thanks to Andy. I know he was in the background there.